Hitler's policy of the final solution evolved. So also this week, we're going to be reading a little bit more in depth about what the actual final solution was, what happened to the survivors of the Holocaust, and we're also going to be watching a video from the Holocaust Museum. So today we're going to talk about, though, on how this policy actually evolved, because we kind of talked about this a couple weeks ago when we talked about how is Hitler going to reach his goal of an Aryan state, and how he gradually started to ostracize the Jewish people. And now this is where this starts to take a more ominous it was already ominous, but this is really where all of that kind of buildup really kind of begins to come to fruition and play itself out, to the detriment, obviously, of the Jewish people. So the first thing I wanted to show you, this is a map of the European Jewish population prior to Hitler coming to power. This is 1933. So just some things to take note. The population was roughly 9.5 million Jewish people in Europe. The largest proportion of Jewish people were in the Soviet Union with 2.5 million Jewish people, and in Poland with 3 million Jewish people. So Poland by far had the largest number. And this is where, when Germany invades Poland, this is where the biggest proportion of the death camps and concentration camps are going to be built. This is going to be where Hitler really focuses on the final solution. Also, just take note that Romania had close to 1 million Jewish people. And then if you look at Western Europe, you see that the numbers decrease, where like Spain only has 4,000, Portugal has 1,000. The numbers are definitely much, much higher in Central and in Eastern Europe. I'm sorry that my dog is going crazy because the UPS man came. So God forbid the UPS man tries to deliver something. So some of this we already talked about in the video on Nazi racial policy. But the first thing that Hitler did in 1933 was he began to pass laws that were suppressing the Jews, also sorry for my dog, and taking power away from the Jewish people, separating them from society. And then in 1935, we see the passage of the Nuremberg laws, where Jewish people living in Germany were deprived of their citizenship, and this prohibited the marriage between Germans and Jews, and also basically identified who would be considered a Jew, because under Nazi racial policy, where they look at Jewish people and consider it a race and not a religion, people who would not even consider themselves religiously Jewish were targeted by the Nazi Party as being Jewish, because if you had a certain number of grandparents, again, I'm sorry about my dog, Cashy. Sorry. If you had a certain number of your grandparents that were Jewish, you would be considered Jewish. So, but we see these laws being passed in 1935, which really begin to separate and ostracize the Jewish people. And we see then a coordinated effort taken by the Nazi government to demonize the Jewish people. So propaganda like this came up where it said, recognize the true enemy with the yellow star. Because under the Nuremberg laws, Jewish people had to wear stars of David, yellow stars of David, identifying themselves as Jewish. Here we see, this is a flyer from the Hotel Reichshof in Hamburg, Germany. The red tag instructing Jewish guests of the hotel that they're not permitted in the hotel restaurant, bar, or in the reception rooms, and that the hotel management is requiring Jewish guests to take their meals in their rooms. So basically, following the Nuremberg laws of 35, Jews were systematically excluded from public places in Germany. So they weren't allowed to be out in public. They weren't allowed to eat in restaurants. They weren't allowed to go into shops. And here, we see, now this one, this kind of just shows you just how pervasive this anti-Jewish propaganda was. So if you ever go to a restaurant and you order a glass of soda, and they bring you the soda and they put down that little coaster that you place your drink on. So that's essentially what this is. So you're, out with friends having lunch, you're having a drink, and the coaster here says, whoever buys from a Jew is a traitor to his people. So again, it's this anti-Jewish propaganda. It was pervasive. It was everywhere. There were board games that were made that were vilifying the Jewish people. In schools, teachers would, when Jewish kids were still allowed to attend school, like the one Jewish kid in the class would be brought up to the class, like, hey, boys and girls, so and so is Jewish. Let's point out the different characteristics on this child that makes this person Jewish. And the little kids would like raise their hands. So basically completely humiliating, the poor little kid that's being forced up into the front of the room, but then also making it like a part of like, school lessons, like, this is the characteristics that a Jewish person has, and this is what makes Jewish people bad. So there's this kind of, again, this pervasive, propaganda that was coming at the German people from all angles. So then we see in 1938, one of the first large steps of violence against the Jewish people, and this is something known as Kristallnacht. Now, Kristallnacht means night of broken glass. And this was basically an organized movement amongst the German military and police across Germany and also Austria, because at this point Austria was part of Germany, where Jewish stores were destroyed. That's why it's called the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht. Synagogues were burned. About 100,000 Jewish people in Germany and in Austria were murdered, and many more were arrested. And this was done on a very large scale. And the German government pretty quickly abandoned this method and decided this was not going to be the way that they were going to continue with this, because this is very out in the open. So if you are, a family living in an apartment building and your next door neighbor happens to be Jewish, and in the middle of the night you're hearing banging at the door and screaming and things breaking as like your neighbors are being dragged away in the middle of the night, the next morning you're going to kind of be like, what the heck just happened? And that was a pretty horrific thing to have to live through. Your kids are crying, you're all upset and nervous. And it was just very out in the open. And there was a lot of international backlash, and there was a lot of backlash amongst the people of Germany and Austria. Like, why was this happening to their people, to their neighbors and people that they knew? So that's why we see that this begins to become something that's a little bit more underground in a way, and kind of like separated from the general public. So 1939, there was an idea that was floated around that was basically making it possible, kind of forcing the German Jewish people to emigrate, to leave Germany. The problem was, and there was a lot of different plans that were tossed around by the German government. One plan was to ship all of the Jewish people living in Germany to the African island of Madagascar, or create a reservation in Poland to kind of round up all of the Jewish people. Many German Jews did leave Germany, but it wasn't so easy necessarily just to decide to pick up, leave your home and move to another country. First off, you had to pay a very heavy emigration tax, because a lot of the German government did not want the Jewish people to leave Germany with their wealth. They wanted to make them leave their wealth behind, if they had any wealth, leave their wealth behind in Germany. So they'd have to pay this very large emigration tax, which would, pretty much wipe them out financially. So a lot of people couldn't afford to leave Germany. And again, you have to also remember, Germany winds up occupying almost all of Europe. So if you wind up moving out of Germany, if you're still in Europe, you might not have gone far enough. Like, for instance, like Anne Frank's family, they moved to the Netherlands. They were in Germany, they moved to the Netherlands. Well, the Nazis eventually invade the Netherlands. So they eventually were rounded up there in the Netherlands. Because France was occupied by Germans, northern France was occupied by the Germans, the Nazis were there to round up French Jews. And then in Vichy France, which was southern France, that was controlled by basically a German puppet, there was some protection of the French Jews, but not that much. And French Jews were rounded up at different points and put into camps. And the German government was able to kind of have, take them and send them to concentration camps as well. So the next decision was to put Jewish people into what are called ghettos. And the term ghetto basically the term means Jewish, the term originally comes meaning Jewish neighborhood. So what the German government did, particularly in Poland, which again had the largest population of Jews, about 3 million Jews, is they took all the Jewish people living in the countryside, forced them to move into cities, and then all the Jewish people that lived in the various different cities. And they took like a very rundown area of the city, walled that area off, and shoved as many Jewish people as they could in there. So the conditions were really, really bad. Many people died either from disease or malnutrition while living in these conditions in the ghetto. And while they were there, they were used as slave labor in factories to aid the German war effort. So many of these people were enslaved. They were forced basically to build their own walls, to wall themselves in, create their own prison. And they lived there for a couple of years until until into the 1940s, when the German government began to liquidate the ghettos, take many of these people out of the ghettos and send them into concentration camps and then eventually into death camps. But like I said before, many of these people were used as slave laborers for the German war effort. The other method that the Germans began to use, especially with the invasion of Poland and then the invasion of the Soviet Union, was a creation of a group known as the Einsatzgruppen, which means action squads. And so basically, these were massacre squads. So they would follow behind the regular German army. They would come into a village that the Germans have occupied. They would round up all of the Jewish people. They would dig a mass grave. They would line the people up on the edge of the pit, and they would shoot them into the pit, and they would basically execute them. And it was Jews, it was Gypsies, and it was also various different Slavic people. And about 1.4 million people were murdered in this way. And you could see here, this is all of the sites that these massacres had occurred. So this was pretty widespread across Eastern Europe. Now, eventually, they decided to get rid of this method for some pretty cold-hearted reasons. You could see little children that are about to be murdered, people that are being lined up on the edge of mass pits, and here you could see victims of people that were murdered in this way. But so the reason why they decided to get rid of this method is, number one, it was using a lot of bullets, and they needed those for the war effort, and they figured they could come up with a more, and this is going to sound really cold-hearted, but it's true, cost-effective way to murder people in large-scale numbers. The other issue was that the members of these action squads, if your job every day is to round up innocent people and shoot them, it's going to have a toll on your mental health. And there was large-scale numbers of suicides and alcoholism and drug abuse amongst the members of the Einsatzgruppen. So they decided to abandon this method. And so then we see in 1940, there's a meeting known as the Wannsee Conference. And it's here where they come up with the plan of what they refer to as the final solution, that the goal is to basically round people up. Now, at this point, some people were already in concentration camps, and there were differences between the two. There were concentration camps and there were death camps. So initially, when the ghettos were liquidated, people were brought into these camps and they were continued to be used as slave labor. However, anybody who resisted, or anyone like the very old, the very young, anyone who was ill, they would have been killed almost immediately upon coming to these concentration camps. And then the people that were considered able to work, they were continued to be used as slave labor until either they died themselves from malnutrition or disease, or until they were too ill to work anymore. And then they were also taken to death camps and eventually executed or killed. And then at the Wannsee Conference, the decision was that they were going to try to essentially execute every single person, kill every single person that are in these camps. And this becomes the focus of like a lot of the war effort in Germany. So here you can see people being pushed into cattle cars where they're going to be transported into concentration camps. And a lot of these people were told that they were just, again, going to work in the East to kind of keep them complacent and not fearful. They were told to label their luggage so they would think that they would get their luggage back at the end of the trip. So they were told when they were brought into the camps that they were being brought into showers for, cleaning and disinfecting, and then they were actually put into gas chambers. So there was a lot of methods that were being used to try to keep the people complacent. They didn't really want the Jewish people to actually really truly know what was happening, because then you would have riots and resistance on their hands. In fact, when the Warsaw Ghetto was liquidated and emptied out, there was a pretty massive resistance movement that was waged. And for a time, they were able to kind of push back the Nazi the Nazi officers. But eventually, obviously, they were able to overpower them and they were eventually taken. But when people realized, what was happening, obviously there were going to be resistance. So they tried their best, the Germans tried their best to kind of keep it quiet what exactly was happening so that people wouldn't necessarily know. And even in Germany itself, there's this book I read when I was in grad school called The Nazi Officer's Wife, and it's about this Jewish woman that lived in Austria, and she winds up getting fake papers, and she winds up going into Germany, and she winds up hiding there through the duration of the war, and she actually marries a Nazi officer who knew that she was Jewish. And she, at one point when she was in Austria, had been sent and had to be forced to work as slave labor. So she knew that this was happening. And she still kind of believed it was going on, even as her mother was, sent, what they refer to as being sent east. So she's like, oh, my mom's just being sent east to go to work. And then eventually realized, because the British were broadcasting in German on German radio stations and telling people what was actually happening, then she kind of comes to this realization that, oh my God, my mom's not being sent to work. She was killed. So this was something that, not necessarily the whole German public really knew. And there is debates as to how much the German public actually knew what was happening during the Holocaust. Although if you lived near one of these camps, there's no way you could not know what was going on, because you would see massive trainloads of people coming out and never seeing those people ever again. You'd be kind of naive to not realize what was happening. But like I said before, at least in certain parts of Germany, or Europe, they were trying to keep it almost as rumors of what was going on so that they could kind of keep the people relatively complacent. So this map I'm going to show you here, this is the number of people that died, Jewish people that died as a result of the Holocaust. So I just want to go back to this map very briefly, just to show you again the numbers of people. So here you can see there was 3 million Jewish people living in Poland, 565,000 Jewish people living in Germany, 2.5 million in the Soviet Union, close to 1 million in Romania. And then if you look at this map again, you'll see that 2.8 out of the 3 million Jewish people living in Poland were killed. 1.5 million out of the 2.5 million living in the Soviet Union were killed. 425,000 out of the 980,000 living in Romania. So you can see just how high the numbers were and where it was spread out. One thing I want to point out, the country of Denmark. The country of Denmark, they didn't have a very large Jewish population. It was in the single thousands, but the government kind of saw what was happening, and they took the effort to evacuate all of their Jewish people. I think it was either to Norway or Sweden, and none of their Jewish people were killed because the government stepped up and actually protected, their citizens and didn't let them get evacuated. Because like you see, 90,000 Jewish people died in France, and part of that was because of the French occupation, and part of that was because Vichy France was also kind of giving up some of their Jewish people and sending them there. Hungary lost 200,000 Jews. They were an ally of the Germans, so they were aiding the Germans in carrying out the Holocaust in places like Hungary. So I just want you to think about, how did the final solution evolve, and then later in this week we're going to kind of delve more deeply into the Holocaust and the effects of the Holocaust.